welcome to the Ringleaders Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Howitt. We're going to be talking about the hostages still held in Gaza. Going to talk a little bit about marriage and Noah Webster's dictionary definition, and also about the abortion issue. Stay tuned. This edition of the Ringleaders Podcast first aired live on Friday, May 31st on the Jeff Oravits Show, where I host on Friday afternoons from 5 to 6 p.m. on 97.1 FM. And if you're in the Prescott area of Arizona, 107.9. So if you're in northern Arizona, check out the Jeff Oravits Show. Usually airs from 4 to 6 p.m., and I am your host on Friday afternoons. My podcast website is theringleaders.org, and you are listening to the Ringleaders Podcast. Let's go forward with this show that previously aired on the Jeff Oravits Show in northern Arizona on FM radio. Don't forget about those who are currently being held as hostage by the so-called Palestinians, the Muslims in Gaza. I was just looking at the Times of Israel about this little 8-year-old girl named Ella Eliakim and her sister Daphne, who's 15. They were taken hostage on October 7th by Hamas after Hamas murdered their family members. This 8-year-old girl was finally released after 51 days in captivity. But the interesting thing, as horrible as that is that the Hamas actually took her to stay with families in Gaza. In other words, the families were working with Hamas. So she was moved from family to family in Gaza. We often think of Hamas as this isolated terror group. Hamas is not an isolated terror group. I've said this before. Hamas is the people of Gaza. It's one and the same. The members of Hamas are the children that grew up in Gaza under parents that taught them to hate, taught them to kill Israelis, taught them to beat Israelis, taught them from the river to sea, Palestine will be free, which basically means annihilate, commit genocide on all the Jews, drive them completely out of the land that God promised to the Jews, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Jews are not new to the land. Yes, a lot of them returned to the land after World War II, after the Nazis killed almost 6 million of them and tortured others of them. But there was always Jews living in the land of Israel. I've talked about this before on the show. You go way back to the times of David and Goliath, 1,000 years BC. The Israelis had their own nation, but eventually the Babylonians, first the Assyrians came in around 722 BC, conquered the northern tribes of Israel. The Babylonians came in around 586 BC, hauled off many, many Jews to Babylon and other countries. But there was always a remnant of Jews in the land. And Cyrus the Persian, around 536 give or take, 536 BC, allowed the Jews to return. And then you had Alexander the Great defeat the Persians and come through, and Israel fell under Greek rule for a while. And if you remember in the news recently, there was a gold ring found in the city of David with a garnet stone in it, and that was from the time of the Greek occupation of Israel. After that was the Roman occupation of Israel, the time when Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, was walking around in the land of Israel with his disciples. They were not an autonomous nation at that time because they were under Roman rule, but still there was millions of Jews there. The Romans kicked them out of Jerusalem first and then kicked many of them out of the land, but there was always Jews there. Later on, the Muslims conquered the land of Israel, followed by the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, which after World War I lost power, and the whole region fell under the Allied control of Britain and France, with all the countries around the area, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. All the countries in the area were not autonomous. And with the UN decision to let the Jews have their own state there, not that the UN has any real authority to say yes or no, but they did put their stamp of approval on a land for the Jews in Israel. And again, the Jews don't need that stamp of approval. God promised that land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that promise wasn't based on how well the Jews obeyed God, because we know that the nation of Israel right now is definitely, it's a left-wing nation. There's a lot of sin there. There's a lot of problems. But God's promises to them of the land is not conditioned on their behavior. It's on God's promise to their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as it says in the Bible, and coincidentally also says in the Quran. Yeah, that's right. The Muslim book actually also says that God gave that land to the Jews. So the Muslims don't have two legs to stand on when it comes to saying the Jews have no right to be there, because even their own book which I don't accept as authoritative, but even their own book says, their own Quran says that God gave that land to the Jews. Okay, so this little girl, Ella El-Yakim, she is 8 years old. She was held by Hamas 51 days in residences, not in tunnels underground, but in residences within Gaza. So that shows that at least some of the hostages were held by your ordinary, everyday Gazan. So after the War of Independence, 1948, when Israel got the right to become a nation again, all the Arab nations and peoples around them attacked them. Even Saudi Arabia was sending contingents over there to fight the Jews. The Jews survived the attack by all their enemies on every side, and the Gaza Strip became part of Egypt. But Egypt kept up the war with Israel. You had the Suez War, the Sinai War, that is, 56. And then in 67, you had the Six-Day War, when Israel won back the Gaza Strip, won back the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. And that's how Israel ended up with the Gaza Strip, even though it had previously been under Egyptian control. And a lot of the people there are probably related to Egyptian peoples and possibly other Arab peoples. But Israel regained that territory and has struggled with it for a long time in dealing with it. When I was there in 1992, it was still very open, the border between Gaza and Israel proper, and a lot of people could come and go very easily. But after the first Intifada and the second Intifada and the continuing terrorist attacks, Israel sought a possibility for peace through the Oslo Accords by giving up some of the land that God promised to them. And you ended up with a two-state solution, which is our current situation. A lot of these countries like Norway and Spain and others that are calling for a two-state solution, it just baffles me because that's already where we're at. That was the Oslo Accords, and they failed. The Gazans, as soon as they had the right to run their own elections, literally elected Hamas. Hamas is the government of Gaza. They are avowed to the destruction of Israel. They brutally attack Israel constantly. Israel is on the defensive still. A lot of people are upset about the invasion of Rafah and the potential for Israel's attack in the southern part of Gaza in an attempt to recover their hostages as potentially causing a lot of damage to civilians. But the Israelis really do take a lot of steps not to hurt civilians, including telling civilians to flee areas that they're about to bomb. And of course, that gives Hamas the chance to flee also and to move the hostages that are being held currently. There's still 121 hostages being held by the Palestinians in Gaza, in homes, in tunnels, in buildings, in hospitals, in kindergartens, in tents. The Israelis recently found the bodies of 3 of their citizens. And remember, you got to look at this from a realistic perspective. There's a war going on. This is not a single-sided invasion by Israel into Gaza, not at all. The Gazans are still firing missiles at Israel. They are still firing RPGs at Israel, still shooting soldiers. The Israelis have lost over 600 soldiers. Over 600 soldiers have died trying to recover the Israeli hostages. Over 600 young men and women from Israel have died seeking to get the release of their people from hostage situations held by the Muslim Gaza people. Calls for ceasefire, unilateral ceasefire on the part of Israel is absolutely ridiculous. You've got to think, what would you want? What would you do if your children were captured and taken hostage to Mexico? Let's say the drug cartels came up and took your children hostage. What would you want the United States to do? Would you want them to go in and attack the cartels and try to get your children back? Or would you want them to just stand by, ceasefire, and just hope for the best? The answer is obvious. A nation has to defend its own citizens, and especially children. This is an 8-year-old girl, and she's got a bandage on her hand, by the way. Not sure what happened to her. Hamas made her stand in front of one of their flags and basically beg for the Israelis to compromise with the terrorist so that she could be released. It's absolutely ridiculous. And shame on Norway, shame on Spain, shame on any other country that's calling for Israel to do a two-state solution, to do a ceasefire, or to do anything else that compromises with the Islamic terrorists. And a lot of people might say, hey, Mark, you're an Islamophobe. Well, as a matter of fact, I am. I am afraid of Islam, afraid of the threat it poses. I myself was a victim of a terrorist attack, a bombing by a Muslim guy in Jerusalem, deliberately targeting American and other international students in 2002. This was after 9/11 happened, and one of the first times that the Muslim terrorists in and around Israel attacked deliberately foreigners instead of Israelis. Thankfully, I survived that attack, but 9 people died, including teachers and classmates of mine. Yes, I am an Islamophobe. And I'll even push this further. In 2013, my wife was running the Boston Marathon. Thankfully, she ran fast, finished early. But 20 minutes after we got out of the finish line area, 2 bombs went off, also by Islamic terrorists. Yes, I am an Islamophobe, not ashamed to say it. And I think it's wise to be afraid of, to have a proper fear of those who are trying to kill you and to not trust them. I think that's totally legitimate. Last Friday, I talked about on this show my excitement over getting my new dictionary. This is the dictionary. It's called the American Dictionary of the English Language. The difference with this dictionary is it is a copy of Noah Webster's original 1828 dictionary. And it's interesting to see how the liberals have gotten a hold of our dictionaries and have changed things. So in this dictionary, in the modern dictionary, the 2020 dictionary, marriage is defined as, quote, the state of being united as a spouse in a consensual and contractual relationship recognized by law. The mutual relation of married persons, the institution whereby individuals are joined in a marriage. That's the new definition. Do you notice that husband, wife, man, woman are missing from that? Let's go back to Noah Webster's 1828 definition of marriage. This is the original and real Webster dictionary. This is a quote. The act of uniting a man and a woman for life, wedlock, the legal union of a man and a woman for life. Marriage is a contract both civil and religious by which the parties engage to live together in mutual affection and fidelity till death shall separate them. Marriage was instituted by God himself for the purpose of preventing the promiscuous intercourse of sexes, for promoting domestic felicity, happiness, and for securing the maintenance and education of children. And then he gives a quote from the Bible to demonstrate marriage is honorable in all and the bed undefiled, Hebrews 13. So that is the difference between the modern dictionary definition of marriage and Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary, the original Webster dictionary definition of marriage. Do you notice some big differences there? The old dictionary starts out saying the act of uniting a man and a woman for life. Whereas the new dictionary says the state of being united as spouses in a consensual and contractual relationship recognized by law. Nothing about a man and a woman, nothing about for life, and it actually doesn't even say anything about for happiness, as Noah Webster's dictionary said. You know, it's really fascinating to see how the liberals have taken over not just media, but also our books, our history books, and even our dictionaries, trying to change definitions. We've got to fight back against that. And the one way I'm doing it is getting this Noah Webster dictionary and, having it as a reference and something I can read through and really be amazed at what a scholar Noah Webster was. He did so much for American education back in the 1800s, and that carried through into the early 1900s. But so much of that has changed as the liberals have gotten a hold of our schools, they've gotten a hold of our dictionaries, they've gotten a hold of the media. This country really needs to return to its roots, get a little bit of a revival going on. We are a constitutional republic based on biblical values. Not every one of our founding fathers was a evangelical Christian, but they all had biblical knowledge. They all saw the Bible as a foundational book in this country's development and in this country's path going forward. They did not at any time visualize the Quran or any other book as being the book that should be influential in this country. This was a Bible-based country, and we have benefited from that, and we're still benefiting from it, even though things have gotten a lot worse in our education system. When I look back at when alcohol was outlawed, do you remember that in Prohibition? I almost said abolition, but prohibition of alcohol. It was prohibited for a while in the United States. How that all started was decades earlier. The prohibitionists got into the education system and started teaching the young children how horrible alcohol was and how dangerous it was and what a bad thing was and how we needed to ban it. And when those children eventually grew up and became voters and had children of their own who grew up and became voters, eventually you ended up with prohibition. And we realized what a disaster that was, trying to outlaw alcohol. But what I'm saying is it all started back in the schools decades earlier. Those who want to change the path of this country have already realized that the way to do that is to get into the schools and to brainwash the children. One thing Al Mohler recently said, and he's got a great podcast, but he pointed out how there's a whole generation now that has grown up with homosexual marriage being legalized in our country, and they just see it as the normal because they've grown up under it. They don't realize the fact that that really just came about, 20 some years ago. And we could probably point to good examples too. Some decades ago, we had commercials promoting cigarettes and the benefit of how cigarettes were healthy for you. And now a generation has grown up where they don't see commercials on TV or on the radio or whatever for cigarette smoking. And instead, they've grown up under the government warnings that cigarette smoking is bad, various bans on cigarette smoking. And as a result, you don't see near as much smoking now. So there's a way to change minds both through education, but also through passing laws. A great example is in the USSR, atheistic government there that promoted atheism to all their people. There's a whole generation of Russians, a couple generations of Russians that have grown up without any exposure to faith, the spiritual, the Bible, or anything like that. And it's so foreign to them in a country where, in their instance, Eastern Orthodox was so well established. But due to the atheism brought under communism, they've forgotten about that and they've lost their education and kind of lost their way. And you could say the same for China. But the point is, it's not only that the education system will teach you, but also the very laws that are passed will teach a populace either for good or bad, because the law itself is an instructor. The same goes for raising kids. You make rules for them, and those rules actually instruct your kids when you make those rules. And hopefully they're good rules. A rule that says, don't walk to your little kids, don't go out in the street or through a parking lot without holding my hand. That instructs them in a way of safety. And, I always tell my girls, look both ways, and I'm instructing them in safety, and it becomes ingrained in them. My rule becomes an education to them. And so it's not just telling people right and wrong or how to think, but actually using law to instruct them, using rules to instruct them. And that's what the left has also realized. You get a law passed, and if it stays law long enough, it actually instructs the populace. And so if we look at the whole abortion issue, the abortion issue was returned to the states in the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court, so each state could make their own decisions about abortion. Well, the fact that abortion was legal for so long in the United States, since 1973 nationwide and earlier in certain states, it has become an instruction to people. And a lot of people I would think would be pro-life have had the abortion being legal for so long that they are used to that, and that has instructed them that, maybe abortion's not so bad, or maybe it's needed, even though it's never needed. And recently somebody was talking to me about ectopic pregnancies, because I said that, maybe we need an abortion in the case of an ectopic pregnancy. But that's not really the case. If you are performing abortion, the goal there is to kill the child that's in the womb and to take it out. Whereas treating an ectopic pregnancy is often removing a fertilized cell that is implanted in the fallopian tube. You're taking the whole tube out to save the mother's life. And as a consequence, the unborn child is either already dead or dies. That's not abortion. That's not targeted at the child. That's targeted at actually health care of the mother that has a consequence that may result in the death of the unborn child in your attempt to save the mother's life with surgery. However, that is not an abortion. Abortion is when you actually go in and try to kill the child, typically as part of birth control, not as part of saving the life of the mother or anything like that. Those are always lies that we're told. Abortion its purpose is birth control or genetic selection. Either one of those is just wrong. And one thing we've seen since abortion became mostly outlawed in Arizona is a rise in vasectomies. And even Planned Parenthood, who is one of the biggest, probably the biggest abortion provider in the United States, has actually turned to doing a lot more vasectomies because they've become in such high demand. It's a fairly simple procedure that can make some money because they're just in it for money, really. A little bit of ideology. But it's interesting. That just really shows that abortion was used as a contraceptive. Once you make abortion illegal and the rate of vasectomies goes up, that says only one thing: abortion being used as a contraceptive. You've been listening to the Ringleaders Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Howitt. This particular edition aired previously on the Jeff Orbit Show on 97.1 FM in northern Arizona. You can see the Ringleaders website at theringleaders.org.